And God said, Be light made, and light was made. And God saw the light, that it was good. And he divided the light from darkness, and he called the light day, and the darkness night. Words like these have guided and directed human civilization for millennia. People have dedicated their entire lives to memorizing and transcribing words like them. They've shaped the fate of countless people and nations. Yet, today, let's say you were someone who somehow knew absolutely nothing of history, and you were to read through a series of classical literature and philosophy on the one hand. Then, on the other, you came to the Holy Bible or the Quaran or the Bhagavad Gita or other books like that. You might end up scratching your head, wondering just how the second set of text, the ones that can kind of sound a bit funny, the ones that to us nowadays can sometimes seem even self-contradictory at times, ended up being the ones that influenced and guided the masses of humanity throughout the ages. The ones that even today are held far more dear to people all around the world than the other ones that, at least at first glance, might appear to be more well-formulated and logical. Now, we certainly can't do a comprehensive examination of all religious history and sociology in this video, but I believe understanding some of the scientific research just around the concept of literacy can go a long way in helping us see things like this in a new perspective, as well as pave the way for us to rethink a lot of our assumptions about education and learning in today's world. So, let's get started. Many people today might make statements like this one. It is essential that the fundamentals of knowledge be taught. Essential that all should be able to read and write. But what truly does this mean? And what actually does it mean to be able to read and write? And why is that placed as the fundamentals of knowledge? What about things like addition, multiplication, and division? Aren't they just as fundamental to knowledge as reading and writing? Well, consider this. How were you taught to multiply 23 by 16? Likely, you were taught some process of writing the different numbers next to each other, breaking down each digit, and stepping through it piece by piece. Even for many people who can do this calculation in their heads nowadays, it's because they learned how to do it first with paper, and sometimes they still visualize themselves going through that same process in their head. Consider how difficult it would be if I gave you a paper and a pen and asked you to multiply 136 by 87, but I stipulated you could only do it using Roman numerals. Now consider how difficult it would be if you had never learned to use a pen and never seen paper, or any of the thinking processes connected to that throughout your entire life. Well, let's think a bit about how the world looked back when most of the world's major religious texts were first formed. As we know, most of these texts were not originally written, some not for many generations after. They came at a time when all stories were transmitted only by the tongues of bards and poets, and there were only stories. No persuasive essays, no instruction manuals, no consistent lectures. Only stories could successfully reach through and permeate an entire society. Okay, so no writing, lots of stories. What's the big deal about that? It turns out the implications of this are far further reaching than we might imagine. See, there are a few societies in the world today who still live by oral tradition rather than using reading and writing. And by looking at them, we can get a glimpse into just how different older societies, where major religious texts were first formed, were like as compared to us nowadays. Back in the 1930s, a man named Alexander Luria was interested in understanding the different Russian societies and began to notice striking differences between ones which relied on oral tradition versus those able to read and write. For example, he'd ask questions like, "In the far north, where there is snow, all bears are white. Novaya Zemlya is in the far north, and there is always snow there. So, what color are the bears there?" Literate societies would consistently respond, well, white. But a typical response from an illiterate society would have been something like, I don't know. I've seen black bears. I've never seen any others. And he'd run through a series of other cognitive questions, getting consistently different responses from the literate groups and the illiterate groups. Now, this in and of itself doesn't mean much. It could easily be that the literate groups were also different because they had schools, and therefore, they were more used to answering these kinds of questions. Whereas, maybe the illiterate groups just thought Luria was some kind of weirdo, showing up out of nowhere, asking them about the color of remote bears and how to classify different tools. And maybe they just really wanted him to go away. We don't know. But what we do know about his work is it started a movement of researchers all around the world who became fascinated as they found out how consistently all illiterate societies tend to only think about concrete, tangible world in front of them, and are completely absent the type of abstract thinking or categorization we typically think of as natural and commonplace. Ultimately, another researcher named Walter Ong was inspired to look through the records of oral stories throughout cultures throughout time and align them with what we know about the human brain. He came to the conclusion that there are indeed great differences in the ways literate and non-literate people think. More specifically, he recognized the differences can be so extreme that people in one group don't necessarily even have the ability to think about how people in the other group would think. He wrote, "Fully literate persons can only with great difficulty imagine what a primary oral culture is like." Now, it's important to recognize what he's not saying. He goes out of his way to dispel the notion that a person from a literate society is somehow some totally superior human being in every way, and that the mind of an illiterate person is simply inferior because it's unable to classify and categorize in the way that we do. Remember, it was commonplace back in olden times for an individual bard or poet or storyteller to memorize incredibly lengthy epic tales with ease, much the same way someone today might look back at Luria subjects who were unable to tell him that a bear in a town in the far north would be white and laugh at them for their ignorance. A poet from a millennia ago would look at a student today struggling to accurately memorize a paragraph of text and perhaps laugh at how incompetent and unable to memorize passages we've become today. We'll actually talk much more about all that in part 2 of this series. But for now, the important discovery from Walter Ong that we'll focus on is the particular ways people from older cultures were able to grasp and remember stories so well. He found that, for this to be successful, all the stories had to follow certain principles. They couldn't just be any stories. You couldn't have given them an essay from today and expected them to memorize them with ease. Rather, it had to be a story that conformed to certain principles. We'll skim over some of them briefly here, but if you'd like to understand them in more depth, be sure to check out Ong's complete work. The first principle is that a text from an oral culture needs to be additive rather than using subordinate clauses or other more complicated grammatical structures. Take a look at how many times the word "and" would appear in the older versions of the Bible as compared to a version rewritten in the 1970s to feel more familiar to modern audiences. Although the latter may feel better written to us nowadays, the former absolutely made more sense to the people of the time and was delivered in that manner at that time for good reason. To be remembered and transmitted successfully, oral text also needed to be aggregative rather than concise. For someone schooled in modern writing, this may seem counterintuitive, but the longer and perhaps more rambly a text is, the easier it can be to memorize. The brave soldier is actually preferable to just the soldier. The beautiful princess to the princess. The sturdy oak over the oak. And it's not just what we think of as rambly. Oral texts also need to be redundant and repetitive. When writing an essay, we're taught to be concise and single focus. But when creating stories to be memorized, it's actually necessary to include back loops and all sorts of redundant tools the memorizer can use to create patterns in their mind. Maybe think about how much easier you might have found it to memorize a song than to memorize just the lyrics. By adding an extra melody to the lyrics, it forces only certain words that fit the melody to make sense, therefore making it easy to memorize. By repeating lots of information, it creates an internal check that only words that align with what was previously said would make sense within a story to be memorized. And this aligns with another principle, that stories from oral cultures need to be related and connected to concepts that their listeners already know. No single story can be too dramatically different from others that come before it. Also, all elements in an oral story need to be composed of familiar objects. Conflicting information and arguments need to be situated within a proverb or a riddle. An abstract persuasive argument could never be remembered and transmitted across multiple listeners in the same way a proverb or riddle could. Abstract thinking is always kept to a minimum. A great scientist may simply be described as some mysterious wizard. Okay, so that was maybe an exhausting list. And how is all that relevant to today or how we think about religion? Well, think about the following passage from the Bible.
And there appeared a great wonder in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 crowns upon his head. And his tail drew down the 3rd part of the stars of heaven, and did cast them on the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman which was ready to deliver, for to devour the child as soon as it was born.
Now consider this possible explanation of the passage developed for a literate society. These signs are an allusion to the dynasty of the Umayyads, who dominated Islam. 7 heads and 7 crowns mean 7 countries and dominions over which the Umayyads had power. They were the Roman dominion around Damascus, the Persian and Arabian and Egyptian dominions, together with the dominion of Africa, that is to say, Tunis, Morocco, and Algeria, the dominion of Andalusia, which is now Spain, and the dominion of the Turks and Transonia. The Umayyads had power over these countries. The 10 horns means the names of the Umayyad rulers. That is, without repetition, there are 10 names of rulers, meaning 10 names of commanders and chiefs. The first is Abu Sufyan and the last Marwan, but several of them bear the same names. The Umayyads, of whom the first was Abu Sufyan, Amir of Mecca and the chief of the dynasty of the Umayyads, and the last was Marwan, destroyed the 3rd part of the holy and saintly people of the lineage of Muhammad, who were like the stars of heaven. The woman is the law of God. The dragon was standing near the woman to devour her child, and this child was the promised manifestation, the offspring of the law of Muhammad. The Umayyads were always waiting to get possession of the promised one, who was to come from the line of Muhammad, to destroy and annihilate him. For they much feared the appearance of the promised manifestation, and they sought to kill any of Muhammad's descendants who might be highly esteemed. So, a common reaction might be, wait, what? That's a lot of extrapolations. No. Religion is all just weird. If that's what the Bible was trying to say, it would have just said so. But instead, it was some story about a dragon pulling stars out of the skies. And now, centuries later, people just happen to be making up stories that fill things in as it suits them. But if we remember what Ong's principles were, this more modern explanation of the passage violates essentially every principle listed and would have had virtually 0 chance of propagating or surviving within an oral culture. What's more, the audience of the time probably would have been as baffled by this type of specific explanation as Luria's subjects trying to understand that a polar bear could be white. It would have been completely over their heads. The original version, however, the one with the dragon and the stars, that's something they would have been much more accustomed to hearing. And now we'll never know for sure, but it's quite likely that it would have been more natural for them to correctly take whatever meaning the author originally intended from it than are the chances that a typical person from today's literate society would naturally take when they hear a passage like that. Again, as Walter Ong concluded after his many years of research, fully literate persons can only with great difficulty imagine what a primary oral culture is like. So, naturally, people from an oral culture were probably much more likely to accurately understand stories from within an oral culture. So, that concludes part 1 of this series. Keep an eye out for part 2, where we'll look at literacy today, reading, writing, and beyond, along with how that informs how we could be thinking about education today and having a voice in modern society.